I wasn't supposed to be working that night. That's the thing I keep coming back to, even now. Kezia had called in sick, 3rd time that month, and I'd agreed to cover her shift because I needed the money and because saying no has never been something I'm particularly good at. So instead of being home with my daughter, watching some terrible reality show, and eating cereal straight from the box, I was standing in the break room of the Harwood, tucking my hair into a low bun, and wondering how I'd gotten to 31 years old still doing this. The Harwood is the kind of restaurant that makes you feel like you should apologize for existing if you're not wearing a watch that costs more than your monthly rent. Dark wood paneling, linen so white it almost hurt to look at, and a clientele that never once said thank you and somehow made that feel like a compliment. I'd worked there for 2 years, long enough to know every regular by their order, long enough to stop flinching when they looked through me like I was part of the furniture. My name is Serena Okafor. I was a 31-year-old single mother working double shifts at a fine dining restaurant in downtown Toronto, while trying to figure out how to cover my daughter's physiotherapy appointments on a server's income. My daughter, Zara, is 8. She was born with a mild hip dysplasia that had mostly corrected on its own, but the specialist had recommended ongoing physio, and the partial coverage from my benefits plan wasn't doing nearly enough. Every month I looked at the numbers, and every month the numbers looked back at me, unbothered. That's where I was, mentally, when I walked out onto the floor that night. I remember it being quieter than usual for a Thursday. A few tables of corporate dinners, a couple celebrating something, anniversary, maybe, or an attempt at saving one. And then, near the back, by the window that overlooked the courtyard, him. I didn't know who he was at first. That's important. I want to be honest about that because it matters later. He was sitting alone at a table set for 4. No briefcase, no phone in his hand, which in this city, at this restaurant, was unusual enough that I noticed. He was just sitting there, watching the courtyard like he had all the time in the world, and had simply decided to spend a portion of it here. Dark suit, no tie, dark hair, a little long at the collar, a face that was, I don't know how else to say this, the kind of face that makes you feel like you've been asked a question you don't quite know how to answer. My section. Of course he was in my section. I smoothed my apron, picked up the water and approached the table. "Good evening," I said. "Can I tell you about our specials?" He looked up. That was it. That was the whole moment. He just looked up. But something shifted in the air between us. Some small cellular thing, and I stood there for half a second longer than I should have before I recovered and kept going. "We have a seared Arctic char tonight with a lemon beurre blanc, and the chef is also offering a dry-aged strip loin with a wild mushroom reduction." "What do you recommend?" he asked. His voice was low, unhurried, like he already knew the answer but wanted to hear what I'd say. "The char," I said. "The strip loin is excellent, but the char tonight is." I paused. "It's the right choice." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "Then the char," he said, "and whatever wine you'd pair with it." He didn't look at the menu again, just held my gaze for a moment, not long enough to be rude, but long enough to register, and then turned back to the courtyard. I went back to the kitchen and stood for a second at the pass, hand on the counter. "You okay?" my coworker Dev said behind me. "Fine," I said. "Table 12. Char and a chablis. The guy sitting alone?" "Don't," I said. Dev grinned and disappeared. The rest of the service passed the way services do when you're running on autopilot. The wine, the entree, the dessert menu he declined, the bill he paid without looking at it. But twice during the night I looked up and found him already looking at me. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable exactly, in a way that made me aware of myself in a manner I hadn't been in a very long time. He left a tip that was almost equal to the cost of his meal. No note, no lingering, just a precise fold of bills tucked under the edge of the water glass, and then he was gone. I found out who he was 3 days later when my manager, Philippe, called me into his office before the Friday service. "Callum Voss was in Thursday night," he said, watching my face. The name landed differently than I expected. I'd heard it, of course. Everyone in this city had heard it in some form or another, in the business section of the Globe, in the kind of hushed conversation people have when they're pretending not to be impressed. Callum Voss, 43 years old, real estate and development on the surface, private equity, port logistics, and according to the more cautious corners of the financial press, other things that no one quite had the evidence to name. "He's requested you," Philippe said. I stared at him. "He called this morning. He has a dinner next Tuesday. Private room, 6 guests. He requested Serena. I assume that's you unless you gave a false name." "I didn't give him any name," I said. Philippe shrugged. "He found out. He'd like you specifically to serve the table." I should have said no. I know that now. I knew it then, probably. Somewhere under the part of me that was already calculating what that kind of tip could do for Zara's physio bill. "Fine," I said. The private room at the Harwood is a separate space off the main dining room, with its own entrance and no windows facing the street. I'd served in there maybe 4 times before. It's the kind of room that exists because some conversations need walls. I arrived to find Callum Voss and 5 other guests already seated. 2 men who had the look of lawyers. A woman in her 60s who spoke to everyone with the authority of someone who has never once second-guessed herself, and 2 others who barely spoke at all and watched everything. Callum was at the head of the table. He saw me come in, and something about his posture, the slight straightening, the almost imperceptible shift of attention, made my chest feel strange. The dinner went 3 hours. Business conversation I was trained not to hear. A bottle of Burgundy that I recognized as being worth more than my week's rent. And Callum Voss, who asked me twice during the evening whether I was doing all right. Not in a performative way. In a way that made it seem like the answer actually mattered. When the guests were leaving, he stayed behind. "You didn't tell me your name Thursday," he said. "Server don't usually introduce themselves." "I know," he said. I asked anyway. I started clearing the glasses. "Mr. Voss." "Callum," he said. "Please." I stopped, looked at him. He was watching me with that same quality of attention I'd noticed the first night. Like the rest of the room had simply become irrelevant. "Callum," I said, trying it out cautiously. "Is there something you need?" "Yes," he said, "to take you to dinner. Somewhere that isn't here." I laughed. I didn't mean to. It came out before I could stop it, slightly too surprised to be polite. "I'm your server." "Tonight," he said. "But not permanently. You're a person who happens to be serving me dinner. I'd like to reverse that dynamic." "I have a daughter," I said, because it's what I always say. It's my shortest way of explaining my whole life. He didn't blink. "How old?" 8. He nodded, like I'd confirmed something he'd been waiting to hear, and said, "What's her name?" Something about that question, the specificity of it, the absence of the polite discomfort most men produced at the mention of a child, undid something in me, very slightly, at the edges. "Zara," I said. "Serena and Zara," he said. "Friday, if you're free. There's a restaurant in Yorkville. Nothing like this, smaller. Good food. I'll send the address. You don't have my number." He smiled. Just barely. "I'll manage." He did manage. I got a message the next morning from a number I didn't recognize. Just the name of the restaurant and a time. No pressure, no looking forward to it. Just the information, clean and simple. I stared at my phone for a long time before I replied. I said yes. I don't know why I'm surprised, even now, that I said yes. Zara was with my mother that weekend. I hadn't been to dinner with someone. As a person, not a server. In almost 2 years. And there was something about the way Callum Voss had looked at me, like he'd already decided I was worth the inconvenience of waiting, that I didn't entirely know how to resist. The restaurant was exactly what he'd said. Small. A place in Yorkville I'd walked past 100 times without going in. The kind of spot with no sign outside and a menu on a chalkboard. He was there when I arrived, which I noticed. Men who want to impress tend to arrive after. He stood when I came in. Dinner was 2 hours of conversation that felt like 20 minutes. He asked about Zara. Real questions, not polite ones. About the physiotherapy, about her school, about what she was like. I found myself telling him about the hip dysplasia and the benefits shortfall and the spreadsheet I kept on my phone trying to balance it all. And I remember stopping mid-sentence thinking, why are you telling him this? But he was listening in a way that people mostly don't anymore. Completely. No phone on the table. What would the physio cost covered properly? He asked. That's not why I told you, I said quickly. I know, he said. I'm asking because I'm curious about the number, not because I'm about to write a check. I'm not trying to buy anything. I believed him. That was its own kind of problem. We talked about other things too. He'd grown up in Vancouver. His parents had emigrated from Germany. His mother had been a teacher. His father had worked construction before building a small contracting company that Callum had eventually absorbed into something much larger. He talked about his father carefully, like he was selecting which words were safe to use. I filed that away. "What is it that you actually do?" I asked near the end of the meal. Straightforward. I've never been good at the dance of not asking. He looked at me for a moment. "A lot of things," he said. "Real estate development, mostly. Logistics. Some private investment." "That's what you say publicly," I said. Something shifted in his face. Not defensively. More like he was recalibrating, deciding how much of himself to be. "You've looked me up," he said. "You had me specifically requested to a private dinner," I said. "I'd be an idiot not to." That almost smile again. "Fair enough, so?" I said. He was quiet for a moment, turning the stem of his wine glass slowly. "There are parts of my business that operate in spaces most people prefer not to know about," he said. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise with you, but I will tell you that I'm careful, and that nothing I do touches people who don't choose to be in the middle of it." It was an honest answer. Not a clean one, but honest, and I'd been lied to so smoothly, before that honesty, even complicated honesty, felt like something I could hold. I drove home thinking about that. He texted the next morning, "How's Zara?" Just that. "Not last night was great, or I'd like to see you again." Which were the things I'd been braced for, just an inquiry about my daughter. I wrote back, "She has physio today. She complains about the exercises, but she does them." He replied, "That's all any of us can do." It went like that for 3 weeks. Dinner twice more. A walk along the waterfront one Sunday afternoon, when Zara was with my mom, and the November air was cold enough to see your breath. He brought coffee from a place on King Street, and we walked for 2 hours and talked about everything and nothing. He was careful with me in the way that people are careful with things they don't want to break, and I kept telling myself to be sensible. I kept reminding myself what I knew, or half knew, about who he was. The 4th Sunday, I introduced him to Zara. I wasn't planning to. She was home, and he'd come to pick me up for an afternoon out, and she appeared in the hallway, in her socks, with her hair in 2 uneven braids she'd done herself, and she looked at Callum Voss the way 8-year-olds look at strangers, sizing him up with the honesty adults train themselves out of. "Who are you?" she said. "Callum," he said, crouching down so he was at her level. "You must be Zara. Your mom said you're excellent at doing your own hair." Zara touched one of the braids. "It's not that good. Better than mine," he said. She almost smiled. "Which is, if you know Zara, an achievement." I stood there watching him talk to my daughter, and felt something complicated and warm happening in my chest that I very much did not have a plan for. Things shifted after that. Not dramatically. He didn't move in, didn't start appearing at every meal, but he was present in a way that started to feel like a weight I'd been carrying for 8 years becoming, slightly, more evenly distributed. He noticed things. A week after meeting Zara, he sent me the name of a pediatric physiotherapy practice in Bloor West. "Not offering, just passing along," he said. "Someone I know vouched for them." The prices were still steep, but somehow the sliding scale made them manageable, and I went back and forth with myself about whether to use the reference, before deciding that Zara's hips were more important than my pride. She loved it. It was in January that things became complicated. I was dropping Zara at school on a Tuesday when I ran into Patricia Lennox. Patricia's daughter was in Zara's class, and Patricia worked in financial crime at the RCMP, and she and I had the kind of friendship that is built from 3 years of standing in the same school hallway, real enough and based in enough mutual respect, that when she touched my arm outside the school gate and said, "Serena, can I talk to you?" I stopped. We went to the coffee shop on the corner. She told me she was speaking to me as a friend, not in her professional capacity. She said she wanted me to know that Callum Voss was a name that appeared in a file she wasn't at liberty to discuss, and that the investigation was ongoing, and that she thought I should be aware. I sat with my hands around my coffee cup, and I didn't say anything for a long time. "How serious?" I asked. "I can't tell you that," she said. "I can tell you that he has not been charged with anything. I can tell you that my concern is for you and Zara." I nodded. I thanked her. I walked back to my car and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes not going anywhere. I almost didn't tell him. I thought about that option. Just quietly pulling back, giving less, creating distance without explanation. It's the safer version, the one that doesn't require anything. But I'd been lied to by omission before. By Zara's father, who had quietly built a whole other life while pretending to build one with me. And I'd promised myself after that, never again. If I was going to walk away from something, I was going to walk away with my eyes open and my words honest. I called Callum that evening. "I need to tell you something," I said. He came over. Zara was asleep. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I balanced my budget spreadsheets and signed school forms and drank tea at 2 a.m. when I couldn't sleep. And I told him exactly what Patricia had said. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Everything," I said. "Whatever you can tell me honestly. I'd rather hear a hard truth than a comfortable nothing." He took a breath, and then he told me. There had been, he said, a period in his 30s when the business he'd built had become entangled with people he should have seen more clearly. Logistics contracts that moved more than he'd been told. Money that had passed through structures he'd been given reasons not to examine too closely. He'd been 29 and hungry, and he'd told himself that not asking questions wasn't the same as doing wrong. He'd spent the last 8 years untangling it, quietly, restructuring the company, cutting ties, replacing contracts. He had a lawyer he'd been working with. Had been working with, he said, since before any investigation had started. He was not the subject of the investigation. He had, in fact, been providing information to assist it. I watched his face while he talked. I'd spent 8 years learning to read people. Something you develop when you serve tables. When you're the person other people look through. And what I saw on his face wasn't the performance of honesty. It was the thing itself. The kind that costs something. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" I said. "I was waiting," he said, "to be sure you were someone I could tell." I sat with that. "And the investigation," I said. "If it goes somewhere, if your name comes up publicly, then my name comes up publicly," he said. "I've already made peace with that. I'm not building something that depends on staying in the shadows. That's not what I'm doing anymore. That's not just about business," I said. "That would affect Zara. People at her school, how she's treated." He nodded. He didn't rush to reassure me. He just held that, the weight of it, the reality of it, and let it sit there between us. "I know," he said, "and I want you to make your decision knowing that. It was the right thing to say, possibly the only right thing. Because it meant he was putting the choice in my hands, instead of trying to manage it out of existence." I didn't give him an answer that night. Zara woke up at 6 a.m. and came to find me in the kitchen where I'd been sitting since 4, and she climbed into the chair next to me and put her head on my arm the way she's done since she was a toddler. "Are you sad?" she asked. "Thinking," I said. "About Callum?" I looked at her. 8 years old, hair still in last night's braids. "What makes you ask that?" She shrugged. "He makes you talk different." "Different how?" "Softer," she said, "like when you talk to Grandma. But also a little scared." She was right. That was precisely it. The softness and the fear, running right alongside each other. "I don't know yet," I said. "Okay," she said, completely unbothered, and started looking for the cereal. I called him that afternoon while Zara was at school. "I have conditions," I said. "Tell me," he said. "Zara is not touched by any of this. Whatever happens with your name, whatever comes out. She's a child and she doesn't get to become collateral. You don't promise me she'll be safe from it because you can't promise that, but you do everything in your power to minimize it. That's not negotiable." "Agreed," he said without hesitation. "And I need honesty," I said, "not summaries. Not the version that's designed to make me comfortable. If something is happening that affects us, I hear it from you, not from someone else, not after the fact." "Yes," he said. "And you don't make decisions about my life or Zara's life, what we need, what's good for us, without asking. Not even good decisions, especially not good decisions." There was a pause, a small one. "That one's harder for me," he said. I appreciated that he said it. "I know. But it's the one I need most." "I understand," he said. "I'll work on it." It wasn't a perfect conversation. It didn't resolve anything cleanly. But when I hung up, I felt lighter, maybe. Not certain, not safe necessarily. But like I was moving through my own life with my eyes open, which is the most any of us can manage. 2 weeks later, Patricia texted me, "Just so you know." He cooperated. She didn't say more than that. She didn't have to. I was at the restaurant when I got the message, standing in the break room before a Saturday service. I read it twice, tucked my phone back in my pocket, looked at myself briefly in the small mirror by the lockers. Tired eyes, hair going up, the person I'd been arriving at since I was very young, still in the process of becoming. Callum picked up Zara from my mother's that evening because I was working late. When I got home, they were on the couch in the living room, and Zara had somehow talked him into watching a competition baking show. She had strong opinions about who should win. He was listening to them, his head tilted slightly, that careful attention he brought to things. He looked up when I came in. "How was service?" he said. "Long," I said. "Who do you two have winning?" Zara pointed emphatically at the television. "The woman with the braids. She's the best." "Naturally," Callum said, and I saw him glance sideways at Zara's own braids, and she caught it and grinned at him, and I stood in the doorway of my own small living room watching that happen, and felt something settle in me that had been unsettled for a very long time. I didn't know then where things would end up. I still don't, completely. I knew he had a past that wasn't clean, and I knew the shape of his present, and I knew he was building toward something that looked different from where he'd started. I knew he talked to my daughter like she was worth talking to, and that he'd told me a hard truth when it would have been easier to tell me a comfortable one. I knew that I was someone who had learned, slowly and at some cost, that the right question to ask yourself isn't "is this safe?" It's "am I making this decision clearly with my eyes open, knowing what I know?" And the answer, that night, standing in the doorway of my apartment in the East End of Toronto, was yes. I hung up my coat, sat down next to Zara on the couch. She immediately leaned against me. Callum said nothing, just shifted slightly to make room, and we all watched someone pipe buttercream roses onto a vanilla sponge on the television, and outside the window the Toronto winter was doing what Toronto winters do. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough.